Today I have a guest, my friend Stacy Lomman. She's been a clothing designer for a long time, both for her own line and for other people's lines. She's a graduate at FIT in New York, and now she's a professor there. And what have you taught at FIT? You taught art and draping.
Yes.
And
right now I'm teaching the advanced draping class, and they do, it's fourth semester, and they do an exhibit. People come in from the industry and vote on their garments, whether they're accepted into the exhibit or not. And I've done that for 8th semester as well. So graduating students do a fashion show, and the whole semester is just working on a mini collection, hoping that they get one of the garments into the fashion show. I've taught, illustrator classes. I've taught fine arts classes. What else?
you've taught everything. You're usually working with the next generation of fashion designers.
Yeah.
But on one of my older videos about vintage clothes, we had a request. I think it was from Sheila. Hi, Sheila. She's been blogging in the fashion world for many years. I think as many as me. More than 10, I think so. And she asked if we could give her some tips about how to identify the era that a piece of clothing comes from, if you're thrifting or if you're buying online. Sometimes you're buying a higher end piece online and you're not really sure it's from when it's supposed to be from. So we're going to start with this interesting dress by a designer named Seal Chapman, and of course the first thing you can do is Google the name.
That's the great thing about Google. So
you could also check the tag on Vintage Fashion Guild on that website, because it'll show you the right logo.
Yeah. Now, do you remember purchasing this? Like, what's the...
I did get it from a vintage store, from like
so
a higher end vintage store.
Okay.
Yes.
So you actually were able to touch it, because I think that's important too. When you're buying online, you can't touch the fabric. You can't look inside and check out the construction and see how it's made. You can ask questions and go back and forth that way, but it's always better to see it. One thing that I would say right away, check for fiber content. If the fiber content's not listed, chances are it is like pre-1970, because it wasn't a requirement until around that time to actually put care content labels, washing instructions, so fiber content wasn't always listed, but like I can tell that this feels like silk to me. So one thing that, if you do have a good hand for fabrics, or maybe it's somehow they know, the vintage store knows, most synthetics weren't really used kind of commercially in apparel probably until I'd say like mid 20th century. So when you're looking at something in the 1930s and 40s, usually it's going to be natural fibers. So I think with this, probably silk. And looking at these details, like the silhouette, this type of collar, it does look 40s to me. That would be my guess. This collar might start looking slightly like it's going into the 50s. So this could be late 40s would be my guess.
So there's silhouette, there's collars, lapels, I guess certain types of sleeves have been popular in some decades and not others.
And some of it is finishing, and like if you're not a sewer or that's not your thing, it's really hard for you to like look inside a garment and determine. I studied it. I can look at something and say, oh wow, look, they did this. Like one little thing I just see right here is, and this isn't a specialty sewing thing, but it's just that they added these shoulder darts. And that's something that I teach in Draping 101. When we do our back slopers, you do take a tiny little shoulder dart. Chances are nowadays, this is so small. This is like a 1/4 inch, barely a 1/4 inch on the double, that people skip it. It's expensive to take this one more step. And what this does is just give you the tiniest little bit of a better sculpt around the shoulders. It's a nicer fit.
So one of the things we learned from looking at that Seal Chapman, probably 1940s silk dress, we were discussing how acrylics weren't commercially used till later. And so that's something to know. Everyone likes to go shopping for a genuine 1920s flapper dress. I'm not sure. I'm suspicious how many of the originals are really there.
Yeah.
I bought this for the style and assumed that it was made later because honestly, you know, even without an expert opinion, I just thought, oh, no way, it wouldn't be this intact. But there's no, oh, look, that's good.
Yeah.
There's no label in it, but there are some giveaways.
Oh, let's see.
There are some beads sliding off right now.
Because it was done by machine, right? So you can tell when it's machine beaded as opposed to hand beaded. Let me see the inside of this. And there's no lining. They just kind of stitched it to gauze.
Bring your own lining.
So you can see this kind of like chain stitch type of thing. That's done by machine. So these strands of beads are just done by machine, which means that when one of them breaks, like the whole string comes off.
I'm always shedding beads everywhere
you gotta
I go.
tie that off for you.
And you tie one though, and then another one, and then another one comes loose. It's hopeless. You just have to learn to live with that.
It's hard to tell, but if it's vintage, often they use glass beads, and I can't tell. I think this is probably plastic.
So if someone brings you a flapper dress, or you find one in a thrift shop, and it's, except for the beads all sliding off, it's pretty pristine, you're not getting a 1920s dress.
Yeah, I'm doubting this is.
It's still beautiful.
It's beautiful.
Great. It's great for any 1920s themed party.
Yeah, we gotta save your beads here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Since that didn't have a lining,
I
had to bring my own lining, and I got a vintage, but not extremely vintage slip. But it does kind of give away some fabric information on the label.
Yeah, it does. It says it.
Or the fabric information gives away its time period a little bit.
True.
Another thing about labels is that, remember there used to be a commercial, there was a jingle of look for the union label.
Yes.
And then they would have the name of the union on the label a lot of times, and that would have to end with manufacturing in the U.S.
Yes.
So not a lot of clothes have been made here for how long now? Like not mass-produced clothes.
Yeah, quite a while. I would say in the 80s. At that time, it started to shift a bit, and by the 90s, like so much was made overseas.
So going back to, I guess we think this is U.S.,
mine.
right? Yes.
Yes, and I'm certain it's U.S. This was my mother's, and I used to wear it in high school. And I don't know why I still have it. It's just like it's sentimental. But if you look at one of the things that you can really tell vintage clothing is the sizing.
Oh,
you know, it's like this. Of course, there's no shape to it, so it's more of a shift dress. It's not like streamlined and fitted. But what you'll see is, oh look, the back dart's here, even on velvet. Back dart, see that?
Nice.
So they're still doing back dart. It's so small. Like the cross shoulders and the armholes, you know, I feel so uncomfortable in these types of clothes. People were just smaller.
They were. I spoke about that in the
Totally
video
true.
I did on Ozzy Clark, where the shoulders are incredibly narrow, and he did a lot of clothes for kind of rock and roll royalty of England of the 70s, which means they were all kids who were born in the 40s, which is when, England didn't end all of its limits on foods that came after World War II for like some of them into the 50s. So they didn't get, there was sugar, there was meat, there were things that were hard to get, and they were just had narrow shoulders and there aren't no arm muscle.
Oh yeah.
And I was speaking of Ozzy Clark, who I love very much, and this is one of his dresses. And an interesting thing about his clothes is that he was so inspired by the 1930s that a lot of times 1930s dresses look like Aussie to me. So you have to be careful about what you're, people copy things so exactly, people are so influenced that it could look like vintage when really it's modern. I know many people have copied Ozzie Clark too, so then you can't tell the difference between 2000 somebody or other and his.
What's interesting also is the shank covered buttons and these fabric loops, which you have on this dress right behind you.
Oh yes.
So that's just not something you see a lot. This is labor intensive.
And then of course there's the fit and the style of pieces. And you pointed out that that was not a snug dress that your mom had, so shift dresses were popular
60s,
when.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then the 80s we wore things, this is an original 80s leather jacket. It's very boxy. Yeah, it's very boxy. Everything was just a square.
Yeah.
And this still has quite oversized shoulder pads for this kind of jacket, but nothing compared to dresses and
blazers.
Yeah. The
suit
shoulder
jackets.
pads.
I mean, I'm looking
enormous.
This is like 90s, mid 90s Alberta Ferretti, and they're just starting to come down a little bit.
Yeah.
I mean, you can see.
I mean, if you get a 1980s thing,
the
shoulder pad will be out to here, and the fabric just kind of collapses underneath it.
Well, they should build that out a little bit better. But what was interesting is we were talking about this dress and like the tiny cross shoulder, or the black one actually, completely went the opposite direction in the 80s. The cross shoulder is gigantic, and a lot of times like the dropped shoulder was happening. But if you actually took the shoulder pad out of these garments, the shoulder would still be out here.
Yes.
So then you have to tailor. It's so much work. Like
I do a lot of tailoring work with Jean Echoes Tailor in New York. Saves me with all my vintage decisions.
Because it's not about just taking out the pads, and you have all this extra fabric.
And
then what happens is if your cross shoulder is wide, your cross chest is wide, your cross back is wide, so you have to reshape the whole armhole, which then you have to take in your side seams, and it's just
it's a lot of work.
Construction. So I know that people say, "Oh, can you just alter it, or can you?" I'm like, I'd rather make a garment from scratch.
That's true. I mean, with some rings, some of them I can resize, and some of them it's better to remake from scratch.
You have to take the garment apart first.
Yeah. So to sum things up for Sheila, natural fabrics before 1950s. So you're not going to see acrylic before then for sure, right? And sizing is different.
Sizing is different.
Even up to through the 80s, the sizing is going to be different than now. So, kind of, let's see. I guess if you had a size 2 80s style thing and anyone could get into it, it would be from now.
Right.
It would be microscopic in vintage sizing.
Absolutely.
You can check check for a care label that came later.
Country label.
Country label, and especially countries that don't exist anymore. Right. That's a big clue.
Zippers.
Oh yeah, the metal zipper.
Metal zipper versus plastic zippers. So plastic zippers you don't really even see until probably late 60s. Color is also something to look for because, I would say every decade you can almost reference by a color palette. You look at the 70s, pea green.
Oh,
burnt orange.
True, right.
And
burnt orange, yes.
Right? You're going to see that in prints and even motifs, like maybe paisley. Whereas 60s, it was more psychedelic, bright colors, day glow, that type of thing. So it's not to say that people can't do that now and sort of reference that era, but it's also something that I think can help indicate the year of the decade. If you really want to delve into it, you can look at the type of print and like how, because everything has evolved. It used to be screen print, and there just weren't as many options, and now we've got photo printing and all these types of things.
You remember those 1970s t-shirts with like the weird transfer thing that was
peels off?
Yes.
Now it's done so much better.
No one does that anymore, do they? That would be weird.
Not really, but if you want to try to make it look vintage,
We're freaking out because we're about to finish the video, and Stacy's like, "Oh yeah, I have this," and then she brings out this incredible 1960s set that her mom wore.
And I've worn it, but not lately.
I have never seen
I know you
it.
haven't. No, I really haven't.
So this is a classic 60s silhouette.
Yeah, absolutely. Drop waist. You know, very boy shaped.
Which is kind of inspired by 20s.
It
right?
absolutely was. So it's interesting, like how in the 20s it was very boy, and then it became very elegant. And by the 50s, by 1947, with Dior's new look, the waist was tiny and everything was, you know, very hourglass and feminine. And then it just 1960s it went back.
Went back.
And
to
70s was all volume and you know, flowing, and then 80s were giant shoulders.
This matching jacket is incredible.
So this is suede, and it's still in really good shape.
It is.
But you know, this classic, low, you know, the drop waist, and then this collar. It's a very Jackie O collar.
This must have been
kind of
expensive. Did your mom spend a lot of money on this?
I'm sure she did.
I feel like it would be extremely expensive now.
And the covered buttons and the bound buttonholes, a raglan sleeve, you know, and it's an A-line. I mean, this is very 60s, but it's a great set. And
that's not the original lining, is it?
I believe so.
Wow,
yes, and I can tell it's acetate because I can see how it's discolored there. Acetate really changes in light, so you can see how it's. Can you see how it's shading?
Yes, yeah.
So it's darker and it's starting
I've seen that in many of my
acetate
clothes.
Acetate does that, and acetate also, I'm surprised that it is intact, but it's really heavy acetate.
Yeah.
So normally it deteriorates. Like an acetate lining is just like it just starts to disintegrate and fall apart. But yeah, this is.
So I want to thank Professor Stacy Lomman from FIT
My pleasure.
for coming and talking about these key ways you can figure out where if your vintage clothes that you're thinking of buying are really vintage. And right now I want you guys to click the subscribe button to subscribe to my YouTube channel while I negotiate with Stacy over how much I have to pay to own this set.
Tiny little darts.
Oh no, the price just went up. See?